Right now, you can be on a plane to Tokyo in 14 hours. You can drive 600 miles before lunch. You can cross an ocean while you sleep. None of that is normal. For 99% of the time humans have existed, the fastest way to cross the planet was your own 2 feet. And yet somehow, with no maps, no compasses, no boats stronger than a hollowed-out log, your ancestors still made it everywhere. Every continent except Antarctica. Every climate. Every extreme. How? Start with a number that should stop you cold. Modern humans, the version of you reading this right now, showed up in East Africa around 300,000 years ago. Fossils found at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco push that date back even further and were studied by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin. For most of that time, your species stayed close to home. Small bands, a few dozen people, familiar rivers, familiar hills. Then something changed. Around 70,000 years ago, give or take, humans started moving. Not wandering, moving. Out of Africa into Asia, into Europe, across land bridges that don't exist anymore, over water that should have killed them. Here's the part that doesn't add up. A person walking 8 hours a day covers maybe 20 miles. At that pace, crossing from East Africa to the southern tip of South America would take a lifetime, and then some, passing it down through grandchildren who never saw where their journey started. And yet genetic evidence shows humans reached the very bottom of South America by roughly 14,000 years ago. That means in under 60,000 years, small groups of people crossed deserts, mountain ranges, ice sheets, and open ocean with nothing but what they could carry and what they could remember. You need to picture what that actually meant on the ground. No steel tools. No pack animals for most of it. No written directions. A group of maybe 25 people walking behind a leader who was trusting instinct, weather patterns, and a position of stars passed down as oral memory. One bad decision, one poison water source, one harsh winter with no food stored, and that entire line ends. Extinction wasn't a metaphor for early humans. It was Tuesday. So why leave it all? Why walk into unknown territory when staying put was safer? Climate did a lot of the pushing. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in Indonesia erupted with a force that some researchers estimate cooled the planet for years afterward. Genetic bottleneck evidence, studied by geneticists including Lynn Jord, suggests human populations may have crashed hard around this period, though the exact link to Toba is still debated among scientists. Food sources vanished. Grasslands turned brittle. And when your environment stops feeding you, walking toward the horizon stops being a risk and starts being the only option left. But climate alone doesn't explain the boldest move humans ever made. Somewhere around 65,000 years ago, a group of people built rafts, or something close to rafts, and pushed out into open water they could not see the end of. They were heading toward Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that later split into Australia and New Guinea. Archaeologist Chris Clarkson, working at a rock shelter called Majbeeb in northern Australia, uncovered stone tools and ground ochre dated to roughly 65,000 years old, suggesting humans arrived in Australia far earlier than scientists once believed. Think about what that crossing required. Not one short paddle across a calm bay. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, there was still open ocean between Southeast Asia and Sahul, in some stretches over 44 miles with no land in sight. No compass. No way to know anything existed on the other side. Just water, and a decision to keep going anyway. Somebody had to be first. Somebody had to push off the shore not knowing if there was anything to find, or whether their children would die of thirst a mile out. And once they landed, the challenge didn't stop. They stepped into a place with animals no human had ever seen. Giant kangaroos taller than a grown man. Marsupial lions with retractable claws. A flightless bird twice the size of an ostrich. No inherited fear response. No ancestral memory of what could kill you and what couldn't. Every single threat had to be learned from scratch, in real time, with your own body as the test case. Here's where the story usually skips ahead too fast, so slow down for a second. How does a species with no writing system pass down survival knowledge across a journey that takes generations? The answer is oral tradition, and it's more sophisticated than people give it credit for. Anthropologist Patrick Nunn has studied Aboriginal Australian stories that describe coastlines and islands that existed thousands of years ago, before rising seas swallowed them. Some of these stories appear to preserve real geographic memory passed down for over 7,000 years, verified against actual sea level data. That means the map wasn't drawn on paper. It was drawn in story, repeated at every campfire, until it became memory strong enough to survive 100 generations. Now widen the lens, because Australia wasn't the finish line. It was the middle of the story. While one branch of humanity was crossing open ocean toward Sahul, other groups were pushing north, into land that should have killed them just as easily. Siberia, during the last ice age, dropped to temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. No modern code, no heated shelter, just animal hides, fire, and a level of cold tolerance modern humans can barely imagine. Skeletal remains found at Sungur in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, show people buried with thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, evidence not just of survival, but of complex social ritual happening in conditions that would give you frostbite in 20 minutes. And then came the crossing that changed everything for two continents. Around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were low enough that a strip of land, now called Beringia, connected Siberia to Alaska. It wasn't a bridge in the way you're picturing. It was a landmass over 600 miles wide at points, with its own grasslands, its own animals, its own weather. Geneticist S. Willersleff has studied ancient DNA, suggesting small populations may have lived on this land, isolated, for thousands of years before ever setting foot in what's now North America. Imagine that. An entire chapter of human history playing out on a strip of land that no longer exists, that most people have never even heard of, simply because it eventually sank beneath the Bering Sea. From there, the descendants of those Beringian populations moved south, following the coastline, according to research supported by findings at sites like Monte Verde in Chile, where archaeologist Tom Dillahay uncovered evidence of human occupation dating back roughly 14,500 years. That site alone reshaped the whole timeline scientists had assumed for how fast humans spread through the Americas. 14,500 years. Walking, mostly. Following coastlines rich with shellfish and kelp forests thick with food. One valley at a time. One river mouth at a time. Until people who started in East Africa had descendants standing at the southern tip of Chile, staring at the edge of the world with nowhere left to walk. Stop and let that sink in for a second, because here's the twist most people never connect. The same instinct that pushed a small group onto rafts to cross open ocean toward Australia is the same instinct that pushed other groups across a frozen land bridge into a hemisphere no human had ever seen. Different oceans, different ice, same decision, made over and over by different people, thousands of miles and thousands of years apart. Keep going, because staying isn't working anymore. And this is where the story usually gets sold as clean and heroic, so here's the part that gets left out. Most of these movements weren't triumphant. They were desperate. Population pressure, food scarcity, conflict with neighboring groups, climate shifts nobody could predict or explain because there was no science yet, only pattern and instinct. For every successful migration you know about, there were almost certainly dozens that failed completely, whole lineages that walked into a desert and never walked back out, whose only trace is a gap in the genetic record that scientists can infer but never fully explain. That's the cost people rarely mention. The migrations that worked are the only ones we get to study, because the ones that failed left nothing behind. No fossils, no tools, no genetic descendants to sequence thousands of years later. You are only here reading this because your specific ancestral line happened to guess right again and again, across tens of thousands of years through ice, ocean, desert, and disease, when almost every other branch of that same journey ended in silence. So what does any of this actually mean for you, sitting wherever you're sitting right now? It means the restlessness you feel, the itch to see somewhere you've never been, the urge that makes you check flight prices at 1 a.m. for a city you've never visited, isn't some modern invention created by social media and travel influencers. It's leftover software, running in a brain built by people who crossed oceans they couldn't see across, on rafts they weren't sure would float, because the alternative was standing still and hoping things got better on their own. Every time you get in a car and just drive, no destination, just movement, you're running the same program that pushed a small group of humans off the coast of Southeast Asia into open water 65,000 years ago. The tools changed. The stakes changed. The instinct didn't. And that flight to Tokyo, the one you can book in 14 hours, it's the same journey your ancestors made, just compressed. Same planet. Same restlessness. Same species that looked at the horizon and decided the unknown was worth the risk. But before you picture this as one clean line moving outward from Africa, understand that the real map looks nothing like that. It looks like a scribble. Groups pushed forward, then stalled for centuries. Some populations doubled back. Others split, one half heading toward the coast, the other inland, never crossing paths again. Geneticist Luca Pagani, analyzing hundreds of modern genomes across Eurasia, found evidence suggesting multiple waves of migration out of Africa, not a single exodus, with some early attempts leaving only faint genetic traces in populations living today. That means some of the very first humans to leave Africa may have vanished almost entirely, outcompeted or absorbed by later waves, their journey remembered only as a whisper in your DNA. Now think about the sheer variety of problems each new environment threw at them. Crossing into the Arabian Peninsula wasn't like crossing into Europe. Archaeologist Michael Petraglia has spent decades studying ancient lake beds in what is now the Nefud Desert in Saudi Arabia, one of the driest places on the planet today. His research uncovered stone tools and animal fossils showing that, roughly 85,000 years ago, this same desert was green. Grasslands, freshwater lakes, herds of animals worth following. Humans didn't cross the Arabian Peninsula because they were fearless explorers. They crossed it because, for one brief climatic window, it was livable, and by the time it dried back into desert, their descendants were already somewhere else with no way back. That's the part that should really unsettle you. These weren't people executing a plan. They were people responding to whatever the world handed them, one generation at a time, often without any idea that the ground beneath their children's feet would turn hostile within a few hundred years. Imagine building a life around a lake, raising kids near its shore, teaching them to fish its waters, only for that lake to be gone by the time your grandchildren are old enough to remember it. That's not a rare event in this story. That's the pattern, repeating itself across 5 continents. Now go back to the ocean crossings because there's a detail that makes the Sahul crossing even more staggering. It wasn't a one-time lucky raft ride. Simulations run by researchers modeling ancient sea currents suggest that reaching Sahul likely required multiple sea crossings in sequence, island hopping through what's now Indonesia, each stretch of open water a new roll of the dice. One study estimates the total minimum population needed to make the journey survivable, factoring in genetic diversity, was likely in the thousands over time, meaning this wasn't one heroic voyage. It was probably dozens of separate crossings, spread across centuries, most of which we will never have any record of, because a raft that sinks doesn't leave fossils. Once humans were established in Sahul, the isolation created something remarkable. Cut off from the rest of humanity by open ocean, the people who became the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians developed one of the longest continuous cultures on the planet, surviving through multiple ice ages, sea level changes, and the extinction of the very megafauna they once shared the land with. Some Aboriginal oral traditions describing giant animals appear to align with the timeline of Australian megafauna extinction, happening somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago. If that connection holds up, it means some stories being told today are describing creatures that real humans genuinely hunted, watched, and eventually watched disappear, passed down not through any written record but through voice alone, for over 1,500 generations. Compare that to the crossing into the Americas, because the contrast tells you something important about how differently each migration unfolded. The Beringian population wasn't just a quick pass-through. Genetic modeling by Willersleff and colleagues points to what researchers now call the Beringian standstill, a period where a population may have lived isolated on that land bridge for as long as several thousand years before ever moving further into North America. That's not a bridge crossing. That's an entire civilization's worth of time, generations born, raised, and buried, in a place that today is entirely underwater, a homeland with no name that survives only in genetic code. And once the ice finally opened a path south, the descendants of that population didn't just wander in one direction. Some pushed down the interior, following herds of mammoth and bison through corridors between retreating glaciers. Others, based on coastal archaeological evidence, may have moved south along the Pacific coastline, using boats to follow a chain of resource-rich kelp forests researchers now call the Kelp Highway. Either route required knowledge passed down with zero margin for error. Misjudge the ice. Misjudge the tide. Misjudge which plants were food and which were poison. There was no trial and error in the way you think of it today. Trial and error back then often meant somebody's family didn't survive the winter. By the time humans reached Monteverde in southern Chile, roughly 14,500 years ago, according to Tom Dillahay's excavations, they had crossed nearly the entire length of 2 continents, adapting to deserts, rainforests, mountain ranges, and coastlines, all without a single written map to guide the next generation. Every piece of that route existed only as memory, story, and instinct, refined and retaught at every campfire for tens of thousands of years. So here's the twist that ties it all together. You'd expect that once humans finally covered the whole planet, the moving would stop. It didn't. Migration didn't end when the continents were full. It just changed shape. The same restlessness that pushed rafts across open ocean and small bands across frozen land bridges kept showing up over and over, in the movement of trade routes, in the rise of ancient roads, in the reason distant cultures ended up trading goods, ideas, and even genes across thousands of miles, long before anyone had a reason to call it globalization. And here's the part that should really land for you personally. None of this was inevitable. At almost every step, the story could have ended. A group that didn't push off the shore towards Sahul. A population that didn't survive the standstill on Beringia. A lineage that guessed wrong about which desert route had water. You are the end result of an unbroken chain of correct guesses, stretching back tens of thousands of years, made by people who had no idea their decisions would eventually produce you, sitting here, in whatever room you're in right now thinking about it. Think about that the next time you feel restless for no clear reason. The next time a city you've never seen crosses your mind and won't leave. That feeling has a 300,000-year-old resume. It carried people across deserts that used to be lakes, across oceans they couldn't see the far side of, across a land bridge that no longer exists on any map. It's not random. It's not new. It's the same pull that got your ancestors from one corner of a continent to the very edge of another, generation after generation, guess after guess, until every guess led here to you. Right now, you can be on a plane to Tokyo in 14 hours. Your ancestors didn't need a plane. They just needed to keep walking.